a general election is a moment where it's possible to mobilise public opinion to help set the agenda for the next 5 years of government, and we absolutely have to step up to that responsibility.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leading differently. I'm Zoe Amma.
And I'm Paul Thomas. Our podcast exists to help leaders and their teams understand what they need to do differently today to prepare for the world of tomorrow. We started Starts at the Top as a podcast about digital disruption, but we soon realised that leaders were telling us about something more important and urgent, about how traditional ways of leading had changed forever.
We make it our mission to speak to leaders who are carving out new ways of leading, and we cover topics from emerging tech to inclusion, from remote work to mental health and climate change. Basically, all the subjects that today's leaders need to be across in 2024.
Our podcast isn't about shiny corporate case studies. It's about lessons learned and progress made the hard way, and crucially, how that can inspire others. In this episode, we're sharing our discussion with Polly Neate, CEO of Shelter, the charity that defends the right to a safe home.
This episode follows on from our last episode with the wonderful Berry Cochrane from Forward Action. And if you haven't yet listened to that episode, it's never too late to catch up. Berry was a wonderful guest and shared her thoughts on how to mobilise communities at a time of great political change.
With the general election fast approaching, we're sharing some of the recent conversations we've had with guests about how leaders can manage the political landscape throughout and beyond the election, which takes place in the UK on July the 4th. Polly shares her thoughts on many subjects, including how charities and leaders can exercise influence in a fractured and volatile digital landscape. And I think it's fair to say that is exactly the landscape this election is occupying. Zoe.
Yes, absolutely right, Paul. So before we get to a story about the UK's first AI MP, you had an update following the BBC story you shared on last week's podcast.
Yeah, so the BBC, as we discussed last time, have set up social media accounts for 24 fictional people based around the UK in order to investigate what content is being recommended to different types of voters during the election. The profiles are private and with no friends, and they just like, follow and watch relevant content. So in this latest update, the BBC have noticed that dozens of accounts are sharing Vote Reform UK messages. These messages are coming out every couple of hours, and they looked into the veracity of their ownership. Now, these accounts purported to be real people and responded to messages from the journalists, but as the BBC continued to investigate, some of the owners became evasive and then blocked the BBC from talking to them. So we'll share the article in the show notes, but what I really wanted to highlight is the way we decide what to trust or what we don't trust about what we're seeing and hearing online. And I mean, this has always been a challenge, right? It's not anything new, but this election seems to be shaping up as a real exercise in just how much we allow our views to be shaped by individual users and anonymous accounts online, and the prominence of these voices versus the content that's coming from the parties themselves or from the traditional media landscape. And I've been listening to a lot of the News Agents podcast in recent weeks. But again, although this is a really informed listen, it is the thoughts and opinions of three people who are selling a podcast. So it's a tricky landscape for people to navigate, I think, Zoe.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm also quite keen on the podcast sphere for what I'm hearing about election developments. So I do listen to the Today programme in the morning, but I'm also a big fan of podcasts such as The Rest is Politics, also the News Agents as well, which you just mentioned. And there's one I really like with Nish Kumar called Pod Save the UK. So it feels like an election when, going just by us, there is definitely going to be a lot of conversation. There could be some influencing potentially being achieved by the discussions that are being had in the podcast space. So it'd be interesting to see the impact of that. I suppose it reflects to some extent how tribal political conversations are, because I suspect you might well listen to at least a couple of those podcasts if you were leaning in a certain political direction.
Yeah, and it's always going to be the same, isn't it? That the traditional media is trying to give a balanced opinion. Some of the stuff that I'm listening to, I listened to a News Agents episode last night, for instance. They were very clear on what they thought, and that probably starts to permeate my thoughts. But I think I've I'm sort of seeing through most of it and able to make my own decisions. But if my social media accounts, which I don't tend to watch much anymore, but if my social media accounts were being bombarded by accounts that were just spamming me with content all day long, it might start to have an effect on what I see. And certainly when I think about the issue of younger people and what my kids are seeing through their social channels, it does influence the way that they think, whether it's about football or other sport, the world around them. It does start to influence them, what they are seeing.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, speaking of influence, there was an interesting story that we saw, which I think also relates to that lack of human connection in politics. That is perhaps why the podcast space has become so popular in many ways. And this is a story I spotted in The Guardian, which a friend of mine drew my attention to, which is about the UK's first AI MP. So Steve Endicott is he's basically he's a businessman in the south of England, and he's putting himself forward as a candidate in the UK general election in Brighton. Where else would it be, of course, as the UK's first AI MP? So the MP is going to be called AI Steve. Steve Endicott himself, who's the man behind it all, is the chair of an AI company. So an interesting marketing angle there. I mean, that's quite a play, isn't it? It's a marketing campaign. Well, I'm going to put a candidate forward to stand in the election. Why not? Go all in, of course. And he's saying that the AI representative would answer constituents' concerns and questions using a kind of a replication of Endicott's voice and an avatar. And it looks like the problem he's trying to solve is about 24 access to leave opinions and create policies, which is quite interesting. I mean, what it doesn't say in the article, and maybe there's some commentary about this elsewhere, and I'd be really interested to read it, is exactly how he's going to do that. Because presumably, if AI is going to be involved in the analysis potentially, which we don't yet know, but could there be something about taking all of this insight from constituents and then using AI to analyze it? Although, of course, then there is the risk around bias and lacking context of what's actually going on in the constituency. So, a very interesting idea, definitely. And we will await developments and see whether we end up with the UK's first AI MP come the 4th of July.
I did notice at the end of the article that it said, I think it was a Guardian article, and it said the Guardian has reached out to Steve for comment. And I just wondered whether it was actual Steve or AI Steve that the Guardian had reached out for. But
Yes.
it does seem a bit bonkers. And you're right, the sense of bias, if it's restricted to one specific domain, i.e. Brighton and one constituency, might be a bit problematic. And just to throw in the impact of technology, I noticed another article that made me laugh today about the benefit or otherwise of the rise in smart doorbells and what that has meant to politicians canvassing to their constituencies. Now, I thought this would be another negative story. It was, technology means that people are able to vet who's coming to their door and push people away. Not guilty of that at all, much, but I have in the past seen people coming to the door and avoided them. But actually, there was a story in here about one man answering his door from a beach in Spain and then calling his wife over. So this was a politician knocking on the door and trying to canvass votes. The man calling his wife over and then them having a 10-minute discussion from Spain with the politician while he stood on the doorstep. And I think he said, the politician said, I think I secured their vote. So that was quite good. And then there was also a story from a resident of a Hertfordshire village who apparently had come home, reviewed the doorbell footage from the day and found out that the MP had knocked on their door and was so taken aback by the fact that somebody had knocked on their door that they got in touch with the MP to say, sorry they missed them, how much they appreciated the knock on the door. And that, yes, they probably would be voting for them because of that. So with all the negative stories, that does fill me with a little bit of hope in a strange way.
It's interesting, isn't it? So, in the 2019 election, I did a little bit of volunteering with a MP that I won't name, who is amazing, incidentally, just looking at some of their how they could potentially use digital more in their campaign tactics, and we did some very quick and dirty stuff around the user journey of a voter. And it was really, really interesting because it made me appreciate how much of a boots on the ground endeavour politics really is, even in the 21st century. That human connection with people, being able to see them eyeball to eyeball is really important. And I guess that is the challenge around the rise of smart doorbells, isn't it? Whether you can create that connection with people on the doorstep for better or worse. I love some of the workarounds in this article though, and it's great to see that you could still speak to people even if they're on holiday and they're willing to have a chat with you.
Yep. I can't see myself doing it from holiday, but then I did have a conversation with a neighbour who managed to bring us some a postal delivery whilst we were on holiday last year, and didn't realise we had an alarm when they unlocked the door. So
Oh
that
my
caused all sorts
gosh.
of different, all sorts of kerfuffle, which was all good fun, and solved in the end. So now for our conversation with Polly Neate, who's the CEO of Shelter.
We are super excited to welcome Polly Neate, who starts at the top. Polly Neate is CEO of Shelter, the charity that defends the right to a safe home. She is a prominent media commentator and speaker on social justice, housing and homelessness, leadership, feminism and women's issues on platforms ranging from the Oxford Union to the First Women's March London. She was previously CEO of Women's Aid, and before that, Executive Director, Action for Children. And she has spent many years both campaigning publicly and influencing at the highest levels of government. She is also a trustee of Women in Sport and the Young Women's Trust, a member of Bayes Business School Global Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Council, and non-executive director of Wessex Local Medical Committees. She is part of the founding group of A Better Way Network and of the Charity Reform Group. She can be followed on Twitter at PollyN1 and Instagram at Polly@Shelter. Polly Neate, welcome to Start at the Top. We are thrilled to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, we're delighted to have you here, especially at a time when I know you have a lot going on. And
Well,
when we
everyone does,
spoke,
I think.
absolutely, who doesn't? But you in particular, I know there's a lot going on at Shelter. And when we last spoke last Friday, in fact, we were talking about how Shelter's going through a kind of tough, volatile year, like a lot of charities at the moment and the sector as a whole. How are you and how are things going?
I'm good. And I think, I mean, the main thing that is going on for us in one way, we've got internal change going on, and of course, like all charities at the moment, financial challenges. But we're really building up to the general election, which is really key for us because we we really need to get housing on the agenda of the public and politicians in the run up to the general election. And we've got limited resources with which to do that. So it's really drawing on the incredible creativity of our teams, their ability to work together, that link up between what we're doing locally and nationally, our services and our campaigns. We're having to kind of really flex our muscles as an organization at a time when, to use a kind of sporting metaphor, if you like, we're a bit short on protein probably, but we're having to work out anyway. So, yeah, it's a challenging time, but it's also an exciting time as well. So, yeah.
And how do you go about preparing for the election? Because we're all in a bit of a hiatus at the moment, aren't we? At the time of recording, we don't yet know when the UK election is going to be, although there are rumours about when it could possibly be. But how do you go about getting an enormous machine like Shelter geared up and ready for whenever the election is happening?
I suppose the first thing I would say is that as an organisation, I think everyone in Shelter recognises that we need to be bolder, not less bold, in the run up to the election, despite the fact that people have got quite a lot to say at the moment about charities engaging in political debates. And I guess we need to be, what's really important is to be really clear. There's a difference between engaging in a debate on a topic that people see as being political, like housing, and being party political, which obviously we never do, and charities can never do. And what's been important for us is to be more, I think, more firmly rooted in lived experience than we've ever been in our campaigning. So our manifesto was absolutely genuinely co-created with people at the sharp end of the dreadful housing emergency we're in. And that's been really important because it gives it a validity, and it's a kind of strong platform from which to really confidently speak out. The other thing I would say is you need to be fully prepared at all levels of a charity for a major political moment like a general election. So your board, your leaders, all colleagues have to understand what their role is and what the boundaries are that they have to not step over. And then we at Shelter, we're going to push right up to that boundary, don't you worry. So if you're going to do that, you've got to have a really clear understanding of what it would look like to put your foot over that boundary. But fundamentally, the big thing I really believe about charities, people don't start charities just to complain about how difficult and awful things are, or just to pick up the pieces of things being awful and difficult. People start charities to change things. And so we have got a responsibility to do everything we can do to create change. And I think a general election is a moment where it's possible to mobilize public opinion to help set the agenda for the next 5 years of government. And we absolutely have to step up to that responsibility.
There's a big opportunity there, isn't there? I mean, it's interesting. I've been talking to quite a lot of charity leaders about the election and the kind of scrutiny that the sector is under at the moment. But the more I talk to leaders, the more I think actually this is a time to be louder rather than
Oh,
quieter, to be.
completely. Yeah, completely. And actually, um, I guess people are going to say what they're going to say. So it's a bit like anything to do with leadership in a way. You've got to understand your responsibilities and as I said, sort of the boundaries around what you can and can't do, and then operate confidently within that. And people will still say whatever they want, because they will, won't they? So I don't personally, I don't get really that worried about people who criticize charities for campaigning. I mean, I'll always speak up for charities' responsibility to campaign, but it doesn't bother me if people criticize charities for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to take a position, don't you? And then be really brave and bold and obviously adaptable, but to really follow that through, especially during such a volatile time.
Yeah, I mean, we have to take a position on the serious, in Shelter's case, the seriousness of the housing situation in this country, what the solutions to that are, and we have to be really clear about that. And we also have to leverage public opinion. It's not all about insider influencing and talking to politicians. You can't get political change unless politicians believe that voters care about your issue. And so you've got to take strong public positions and you've got to mobilize people. Otherwise, you're just not going to achieve your objectives. So there's a responsibility to do that, as I say, and we just need to get on with it. And we are, don't worry.
So, when we spoke last week, we were talking about how you go about campaigning and influencing in that what's become a very fragmented and in some ways quite insular digital landscape, and to a certain extent offline as well. So what are your thoughts on that? If you're a charity leader out there right now thinking, how do I do this? The landscape is so fragmented now. What's your advice on that?
So I think fragmentation is one problem, and I think the other one is polarisation, which I think is quite frightening. And it's a big challenge for leaders. In terms of social media specifically, I think it's a huge challenge for leaders in our organizations. So I'd be happy to come on to that. But I think in terms of social media specifically, I mean, it's interesting. I've become much less active and less, I share much less, particularly on X platform, formerly known as Twitter. Than I used to be, and that's really not good, because actually, just as it's more important to speak up, I think people are being silenced. And you know, I'm still there. I'm still on Twitter, of course, and I still say what I need to say most of the time. But I think it's always been an echo chamber, right? And people used to criticize. People used to say to me all the time when I was very, very active on Twitter. People used to say, but surely don't you realize it's just an echo chamber? But actually, an echo chamber is a place where you forge connections, you make contacts, you do deals, you find out about other people that you didn't already know were in your echo chamber. You broaden that echo chamber and you mobilize it. So yes, of course, it was always an echo chamber, and I've never been naive about that. But actually, that echo chamber can be a powerful thing. Whereas now, so yes, it was an echo chamber of people that broadly agreed with me. Now I sort of feel like it's an echo chamber of people who really hate me. Like it's completely different vibe. And because of that, I think the danger of giving oxygen to people who don't agree with you is much greater. And also, maybe it's just coincided with me. This is the first time I've actually thought this. Maybe it's actually just coincided with me getting older, and sort of less willing to listen to people who don't agree with me. I don't know. But I think the atmosphere on X has changed a lot. So, as a leader, I think you still have the same responsibility to be out there. And that is important for our credibility as leaders, because I feel very strongly that it's important to be a person with beliefs, views, opinions, passions, and with a broader sense of social justice, because I'm not just a gun for hire. I work for causes that I passionately believe in, and I need to demonstrate that. And that's why I still tweet about things I worked on at Women's Aid, for example, because I wasn't there as a gun for hire either. I was there because I passionately believed in their cause, and same at Shelter. And I'm a pretty robust individual, but I do now take more steps to protect myself on social media. So, for example, I'm a bit of a hit and run now on social media. So I never read replies, pretty much. So sorry if you're like my friend and you've replied to a message and I haven't liked it or whatever. I never read replies. I just, I say what I want to say first thing in the morning and then I leave. Basically, that's me on X now. So I think it has changed in terms of our organizations, though. It's still the ultimate news program platform. People go there for information. People go there for information from your organization, both campaigning and also actually about their problems as well. And our organizations still absolutely have to be on there and very active on there. I also think, just to finish, we need, just as we take steps as leaders to protect our own well-being, we do need to protect the well-being of our social media teams more than ever. So I'll give you an example. If we at Shelter tweet about something like the allocation of housing, we will get a barrage of racism about who shouldn't get allocated housing. And our team have to deal with that. And it's really important to recognize that and make sure that they feel supported and feel that their organization, that experience they're having needs to be visible within the sort of management and leadership of the organization.
I think it might go back to something you were saying about the you equated it to, maybe it's because you're getting older, but I just wonder whether there's a sense of, it's a change in energy, really, isn't it? More than anything. I mean, Twitter used to energize me and energize my day. Used to be that sort of, I'd go there for
Yeah,
ideas, I'd go there for conversation, I'd go there for
definitely.
networking, all of that stuff. And that, as you say, has chipped away, where it's just become, more about the echo chamber of people that don't want to hear from you and will tell you that they don't want to hear from you, and therefore your interaction with it is very different. And I think that's, for me, has coincided with, obviously getting older. We're about 20 years into the sort of the social media bubble, and things are changing quite dramatically.
Yeah, and that polarization that I was just referring to is, I think probably Twitter is where it's most evident. And I think people are much more ready to jump to conclusions about you based on things that you might do on Twitter that you feel are completely innocuous. So, like who you follow, for example. I mean, I'm now careful, much more careful. I don't just follow people because I'm interested in hearing what they've got to say. And because I spend so little actual time on there, I don't even see a lot of what people that I follow are tweeting. And that's because people are going to look through the entire back catalogue of people that I follow to see whether they've said something that they can then be brought back against me. And I literally don't have the time or energy to scroll through the entire back catalogue of every single person I follow. So that's made me then more circumspect about who I follow because, and that didn't used to be the case. It would be, if you retweeted something objectionable, quite rightly, people would come back at you. But the idea that you're sort of somehow responsible for every single thing that everyone you follow has once said is quite a sort of difficult position to be in, really.
Yeah, and I think you've also argued, and I think it's part of the case, this isn't it, that the legitimacy of that as a platform for news, for journalists, for that sort of conversation only happened sort of 5-10 years into Twitter becoming a thing. We had to convince people to go to Twitter to begin
Yes.
with, and then suddenly everyone was there, and that's changing, isn't it? And the interaction on the platform as well. I'm in several WhatsApp groups, and we talked when we spoke last week. We talked about those communities, those very very much echo chambers, but those communities that I might have engaged with on Twitter are now sitting in WhatsApp. And if I've got something to say or something to share, I'm going to share it into a WhatsApp group rather than share
Yeah,
it onto a social media platform. But that
completely.
doesn't help with the engagement with politicians and trying to influence that world.
Some of those challenges that you mentioned about being a CEO who's on social media right now, do you think it's harder to be a female CEO on social? I mean, I know it's a tough environment for everyone, but are there particular challenges that go with the territory?
Oh, God, totally. Yeah, definitely. I think people, well, I mean, it's become I think everyone knows this now. I mean, people are much more likely to be abusive, patronizing, mansplaining, and all of that to women than they are to men. I mean, housing, I can tell you, oh my word, if I had a few grand for everyone who's told me that I don't understand how complex housing is since I joined Shelter, I could build the bloody social housing myself. I mean, it's just like, it's absolutely,
Fundraising campaign right
I know
there, Polly.
exactly. It's and people are constantly doing it on X as well as in real life as well. So yeah, definitely, it is definitely tougher to be a woman for sure. I mean, having been chief exec of Women's Aid, I actually now feel, even despite the fact that Twitter's much more toxic than it was when I was in that job, actually it's less toxic for me as chief exec of Shelter than it was as chief exec of Women's Aid, where you might as well have,
Oh,
yeah,
really?
oh
Mm.
God, definitely. That was much worse. But also, that supportive network aspect of it was much stronger as well. So it was both better and worse, if you know what I mean. And to be honest, I'm quite thick-skinned about what people say about me on social media. I am really not that bothered, to be honest.
It's funny, isn't it? Because there's still that sort of sense that there is a bit of a pile on when the criticism seems to rise to the top, whereas I think on other channels you may see the positivity rise to the top, certainly on Twitter.
I think for me...
But there are still people out there that are willing to fight your corner and to be there as allies. It's just they're pushing through that sort of...
The problem is, if you're not looking at,
as well.
as I said, if you're not looking at replies, then you're not seeing the support either. So that's one thing. And I also think people are less active as allies. Maybe that's just me and everyone's gone off me. but I think it's definitely, that's less active. I also think because of the polarization that I was talking about, which I think is really important, and is our organizations are porous, aren't they? So we are part of the world, and so that those highly polarized toxic debates and the fear surrounding them, and the fear that is out there in the world for lots of reasons, funnily enough, existing now actually kind of reminds me a bit of growing up in the Cold War period in the 70s and 80s, where somewhere there was the threat of a nuclear war was actually like there in people's minds. And I think now there is that kind of sense of peril and danger, and it's coming within then a much more polarized environment. Social media exists, it didn't exist then. And so I think that fear, polarization, people's trauma, because they're afraid and because people are so shouty, I think people's trauma is much closer to the surface, and that exists within our organizations as well. And it's a very difficult thing to manage as a leader, I think. And social media is only one aspect of that.
Yeah, when you mentioned that, I thought that's a really key point. I'm about to go into a social media audit for a client, and I've just added that as a point. It really does need to link the people that manage your social media channels to your support for them, for their mental health and well-being as well, because they're the ones that are sitting on platforms day in, day out, absorbing all of this. And if it's exhausting us as leaders within organisations, it's going to be
much worse for them. Yeah. Definitely. And I think when you get, we get, and I'm sure lots of organisations do, get a lot of very racist tweets. We get a lot of very right-wing, extreme tweets and replies. And we get a huge amount of criticism of the organisation and the direction that it takes. And at the end of the day, those people aren't setting the direction. And so they're kind of feeling like they're being made to be accountable for decisions and choices that they haven't made. If I think about when we had industrial action at Shelter, for example, there was a huge amount of criticism of the organisation. Some of it probably fair enough, some of it actually not true. But the people on the front line of that were our frontline colleagues managing our social media accounts, and that is a really tough place to be in.
It's really wearing, isn't it? I've been into charities to help them after they've been through a big trolling incident, and quite often even looking at the criticism that they're facing online all day, every day. If you're a young person, you've got your first job, you're working in a digital team, I think it's incredibly difficult. So you need that support and that culture around you, which means that you get some protection from that, and you've got colleagues who can help you, and you can start building some layers, such as doing things in quite strict rotas, or looking at where you can filter the
Yeah.
content in some way. But it's a real challenge, isn't it?
Yes. And also, there are other platforms, you know. I mean, our social media team are absolutely brilliant at TikTok. They're brilliant at producing memes about housing. That's a challenge, but they do it, you know. So it's important to sort of celebrate as well the creativity that those teams
Mhm.
have. And particularly, I mean, yes, on X, sure, but you know, on other platforms and in different ways. And I mean, you cannot, if you're particularly if you're a campaigning organization, you can't not have a powerful presence across multiple platforms nowadays. It's not all about how toxic Twitter is, X is. So I think there's a sort of, having said all of that about how difficult it is, there's also a huge scope for creativity and for really being absolutely core to the cause, those teams are. So, and I think that's important to recognise as well.
And
So,
brand new audiences as
Yeah,
well. You know, particularly
completely.
TikTok. That's such an opportunity for an organisation like Shelter to
Oh,
reach
yeah.
kids and people that haven't engaged
Yeah,
before.
completely. And right now, you know, we were talking about it being an election year. I mean, that is really vitally important. You know, there's a lot of younger people, young adults, who are very powerfully impacted by the housing crisis. And it's our job to mobilize them to put that crisis on the public's agenda and therefore on the politicians' agenda.
and if you're a charity CEO and you're thinking, right, the election is coming, being on social media personally is hard right now for all the reasons we've talked about. What would your advice to those CEOs be?
So I'm always getting asked this about, here's an incredibly difficult situation for charity CEOs, Polly. What's your advice? And I mean, sometimes this sounds really bad, but sometimes my advice is just get on with it. Like I don't know. You know, I think yes, it's a very, being a charity chief exec is not an easy job. So most important thing is, you know, go into it with your eyes open, really. And the other thing I would say is, there's so much talk about authenticity and bringing your whole self and all of that. And I think we've got to be a bit careful with that. You don't have to bring every single bit of yourself to work all the time, or to social, certainly not to social media all the time. What you do have to be, I think, is recognizable, consistent, predictable. People don't want to be suddenly shocked by what their CEO might say or do. People want to know you, get to know you, and understand who you are. And for that, I think you've got to be, I think for people in Shelter who know me and also follow me on Twitter or Instagram, I think I'm totally recognizable across all those platforms as the person that I am. It's not super curated or but you know, every single thing about myself is not on social, and nor is it in the office, by the way. And I think that you need to be careful about all these tropes about authenticity and bringing your whole self. It's more about knowing your whole self. I mean, to me, leadership is about self-knowledge, really. That is basically kind of it. And so I think that's where that authenticity piece comes in, is in your self-knowledge and your honest reflection, your ability to learn and your understanding of yourself. But you don't have to bring your whole self to everything all the time. And I think people are daunted by that idea, and it sort of stops them from getting on with it. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense, because I think you can be authentic, but you can still have boundaries.
Yeah,
And in fact, you
totally. You
should still
should.
have
You
boundaries.
should.
Mm.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, there's a under emphasis on empathy in leaders. So you may not have lived experience of your cause or of the issues that people are facing out there, that people are facing in your organization. Um, I certainly don't have lived experience of homelessness or poverty, but you can develop empathy. And I think that's kind of not enough talked about, really, because that's actually the only way to lead through in such a polarized environment is through demonstrating empathy. Now, people won't want that a lot of the time. People will want you to take positions on this, that, and the other thing, on every single thing. I know lots of organisations are under pressure to take a position on the war between Israel and Hamas at the moment, for example. And there are people who won't be satisfied if you don't do that. But what you can do is be empathetic to and understand everyone's experience of that conflict and that situation and how unsafe it makes people feel.
It makes complete sense. And I think one of the things that I wish I had learned early in my career is that sometimes when you're leading something, obviously there are times when you have to do something and make a decision, but then there are times when people, they want you to listen, right? And the value you can add is about giving people time and attention. And I find that particularly with my team when, they might be going through a really hard time at home or something's going on. And I don't necessarily need to do anything other than just sit with them, sit in the mud with them and listen to them. And that's the best thing I can do to help them in that situation.
So true. And I mean, you learn that. This is really terrible. I don't want to compare being a leader in an organisation to being a parent. But one of the biggest lessons that I have learned through being a parent, and I think, is to just, you don't have to solve every problem as soon as you hear it from your child. You want to solve it because you don't want your child to be unhappy. You want to have an answer. But actually, for them, the experience of being heard and understood and listened to is just as important to, as particularly for an older, teenager or young adult. That's more important in a way than having your parent go, "Oh, I know what you should do. You should do X." Do you know what I mean? And actually, I think, as taking it to leadership, then, as leaders, a lot of people who end up in jobs like mine are very solution focused people. And I certainly am. In fact, my biggest failing is leaping to a solution too quickly. And it's just that learning how to kind of sit with a problem and just listen to it and understand it is really important. And that self-knowledge point again, because actually, if you know you're not great at that, the most important thing is to surround yourself with other people who are good at it. So people who will A, stop and think and listen, and B, you then have to be approachable enough and predictable and recognizable enough, as the things I was saying before, that people will tell you. So you've got to have people who go, "Polly, shall we just sit with this for a minute?" And they've got to know how you're going to react when they say that, and you're not suddenly going to react in an unpredictable way. And that's about the whole self point again, and that what it means, I think, to be authentic and bring your whole self.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that because it's the being your whole authentic self. It's not just about you,
Oh
right?
God,
It's
no.
about the
Yeah.
attention you give to people, and it's about
It's
them.
about them and what
So
they
yeah,
experience of
yeah,
you. It's not about, I don't have a right to bring my whole self, literally bring everything about myself to work all the time. And I don't think, frankly, anyone does. And so there are causes that I feel very passionately about that are not the business of shelter. And therefore, I don't bring those to work particularly. I have to find other ways of supporting those. But what is important, so it doesn't, in a way, I don't have to bring every single thing I believe in to work, but I do need to bring the fact that I believe passionately in things and I have convictions and commitments. That needs to be understood, but not every single thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us really nicely to a final thing that we were talking about the other week, where you talked about how, as with many charities, you've been leading Shelter through this non-stop change ever since you joined a few years back, and everything from lockdown to the current pressure on charities. Is there anything that you wish, as part of that, looking back to where you were a few years ago, you wish you could go back in time and tell yourself about now? What have you learned from leading Shelter through that constant non-stop change?
I mean, I've learned a lot about myself and my own strengths and weaknesses, and the strengths and weaknesses of my team, I suppose. And I guess a lot of the things we've been talking about in this conversation, I guess, are things that probably were I sort of knew before, but I've kind of learned and refined those thoughts as I've gone through a lot of change. I think what is most difficult isn't the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, etc., etc. It's the cultural impact of those things is what is difficult to manage, not the things themselves. So I think at Shelter we led, I think, I'm sure some colleagues might disagree, but I think we led really well through the pandemic. What we didn't do is lead as well out of the pandemic. And I think I've definitely learned something there about a crisis it is about the crisis, but actually leading through a crisis, especially if you're quite a solution focused, decisive person like me, isn't that hard. What's hard is then knowing when to. It's not good enough 6 months after the pandemic to look back and go, how did we do? You've got to lead out of the crisis and understand as quickly as possible the sort of cultural impacts of that crisis, if you like, and what is going to endure and what isn't about that crisis. So I think that's probably the lesson I've learned from the pandemic rather than the actual pandemic itself, if you see what I mean. So I guess,
It makes total sense. And I
yeah,
think, does that bring us back to that point about the politicians, doesn't it? It's exactly the same. This is why we're in this situation where we're heading into a general election.
totally.
There is a choice to be
Yeah.
made, and it is about how they managed us out of the
Well,
pandemic. The
yeah.
reason we're at
And
this point, this crunch point
And there's a
in history,
fantastic,
is
yeah,
because of
and
that.
there's a fantastic example in Brexit, isn't there? Although that was like a self-inflicted thing. But I mean, we're going to do this thing. What is it going to mean? And I don't only mean what's it going to mean economically in terms of foreign policy, blah, 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 which clearly wasn't worked out or understood. Well, maybe it was, didn't look like it from where I was sitting, but also about what is the impact of that going to be culturally,
Yeah.
which has been very profound, I think. And so that's more important to me. I mean, the other thing I've learned personally, which I think a lot of leaders do have to deal with, is that so just as we were coming out of the pandemic and I was starting to get around and visit colleagues in the organisation, I had a big, really serious climbing accident, which has had a
Oh,
permanent,
yes, I
yeah.
remember.
So that's had a
Mm.
permanent impact on my disability situation. And that happening at that time and the sort of ongoing impact of that at the time it's all happened has been really challenging. And I think I've learned a lot about, and lots of leaders have to do this, how to manage a personal crisis alongside trying to lead an organization through very difficult times. And I think definitely I could have managed that better, I think. But I hope I don't have to put those lessons into practice again, but you never know. You never know what's going to happen, I suppose. You never know everything's unpredictable, isn't it? And I suppose having that accident really made me realize that, gave me an insight into the unpredictability of the world that we're in, really, and how leaders have to respond. And I suppose that's part of my thing about being consistent about who you are as a leader as much as possible.
That makes total sense, Polly. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your wisdom
about
this
that,
morning.
You're very welcome.
It really was. And thank you for sharing all your insights about the election and where you're at as a leader, and also what you've learned about being a leader as well. And I loved your point about bringing together the personal and the professional, but in the right way and with the right balance
with
that
the right
works for you. With the right boundaries, exactly. And I think that's a really good reminder to leaders as we go into another challenging period. So thank you so much. It's been a brilliant conversation.
It's been lovely to talk to you both. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much once again to Polly for coming onto the podcast and sharing her amazing insights with us. Polly is always fascinating to talk to. I've enjoyed every single conversation I've had with her over the years, and this was no exception. Thank you, Polly.
Yes, thank you to Polly for joining us. Again, a challenging view from one of our guests on the value of social media in today's political environment, but I really enjoyed speaking with her.
Me too, and it was a point that needed to be made, so it's really good to get that discussion out in the open. As always, we really do appreciate that if you listened all the way to the end of the episode. Thank you. And you can support the podcast by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us. It really does help us reach more people. So if you've enjoyed what you've heard, do share us with a friend.
Thank you so much for listening today. We're taking a very short break over the summer, but we will let you know when we're back, and we'll see you with a brand new episode of Starts at the Top.
See you then, and bye for now.